started, and I see people are continuing to join us in the chat. But greetings, everyone, and welcome to the CPTL series, our fall 2021 session. This is the initial session in the series. I'm Brian McGowan. I am the Associate Director of Pedagogy and Higher Education Research in CTRL, where I'm also an Associate Professor in the School of Education, teaching in our EDD program in Air Policy Leadership. And I'm starting my third year here at AU. And we launched this series in spring 2020 to give faculty and staff an opportunity to think critically about teaching, right? And thinking about how to engage with students in the classrooms and frameworks that you may want to consider in your teaching. And we thank the hundreds of faculty members who have engaged with us through this series since spring 2020. And each semester, we like to kick off the series, bringing in an external speaker. And we are so fortunate today to have Dr. Lori Patton Davis joining us. And so quickly, I would like to read part of her bio. Dr. Lori Patton Davis is a highly respected, nationally recognized, and accomplished scholar in the field of higher education. She is a tenured professor of higher education and student affairs at The Ohio State University and chair of the Department of Educational Studies. Dr. Patton Davis is also past president of the Association for the Study of Higher Education. And she is best known for important cross-cutting scholarship on race and racism in higher education, campus diversity initiatives, Black students, particularly girls and women in educational and social contexts, and college student development. She has received many university and national awards for her teaching and scholarly contributions, and has been recognized in the Education Week Public Influence Rankings as one of the top 200 influential educators in the United States. And on a personal note, Lori is so much more than her professional accolades. She has a commitment to mentoring and supporting scholars that is unwavering. I met Lori in 2007 as a graduate student, and from us serving on a committee with NASPA that led to the Journal of Student Affairs Research and Practice, to you serving on my dissertation committee and asking tough questions to push my work, and to co-authoring publications where we illuminate the voices of minoritized populations. I'm proud to call you my mentor, colleague, and friend. And I'm happy that my campus gets to see you in ways that I admired you over the past 14 years. And so with that being said, I would like to welcome Dr. Lori Patton Davis to American University. Let's give her a warm welcome in the chat and on the screen.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Brian, for that introduction, and to all of you who have worked behind the scenes to make sure I'm here and issue the invitation. So I'm really happy to be here, grateful for my relationship with Brian. Yes, we have been at this for a really long time. And so it's been a pleasure to just mentor you, but also to watch you as your career flourishes. And it's also great because there are other people on this call who I've not connected with in a while. And so it's great to see familiar names. So thank you all for the warm welcome under different circumstances. I would have loved to have been there with you physically. I am going to move into my presentation because I know we have a very limited time together. There's a couple of things I just want to bring to your attention. So Brian knows this because he's an alumnus of Ohio State, or the Ohio State. I got to get used to saying the. But I am located in Ramsire Hall, which is a historical landmark and a very old building. And so I have to have an air purifier and air conditioner running constantly. And so if you hear some background noise, that's what that is. That's the first thing. And secondly, I have different screens. I have 3 different screens. And so if you see me looking anywhere that's not directly at the camera, it's probably because I'm looking at the screen. My PowerPoint is not directly in front of me. It is to my right. So just wanted to give you a heads up that I'm not checking email, even though people are emailing me, and I'm not texting. I'm very engaged. So happy to be here. I will go ahead and get started. The focus of the presentation, or title rather, is strategies for promoting racial consciousness and equity in the classroom. I was thrilled to have an opportunity to do this talk because as a department chair, I don't often have opportunities to teach. My department has 11 academic programs and 81 faculty. And so I am fairly busy all the time and don't have as many opportunities to teach, but teaching has been significant in my career, particularly teaching issues related to race and racism and helping colleagues and training doctoral students so that they're prepared to engage these topics in the classroom. So I will get started. Some of these, I don't know the levels of knowledge and awareness that folks are bringing. And so some of this information may be new to some of you. It may be a refresher for some of you. So just bear with me, and I look forward to dialogue toward the end. All right, so the guiding questions that I used to pull together this talk were threefold. One, why is racial consciousness and equity in the classroom so difficult, right? And what are the consequences when they're absent? And lastly, what are some strategies that we can enact around racial consciousness and equity mindedness in the classroom? When I do presentations like this, I use language, and I'm well aware that sometimes the language that I'm using may be unfamiliar to people. And so I wanted to share a few things for you to think about. The other piece around this is that when I am having conversations that deal with difficult topics like race and racism or white supremacy, I try to be as open and honest as possible. And my goal is never to tiptoe or to avoid naming, the issues as they are. And my hope is that, you all model that in the classroom and in your other interactions. And that this, information can be challenging, but because I do a lot of work around student development, I've learned over the years that development and growth is never easy, right? There's some sort of crisis that happens there that helps to foster and facilitate growth. And so that's one thing to keep in mind. The other piece is that we're just in a really challenging socio-political context and climate, and there are heightened efforts to suppress voices like mine and like Brian's, especially folks who are doing critical race theory, as you're well aware, and I'll talk about that later. And so in doing this talk, I'm conscious about the consequences, whether they are positive or negative. And so my goal is to present the information and, go from there. So language. Rather than using phrases like minority, I use minoritized, right? And so I use it because I think people are constructed as minorities, right? They are placed in situations that, or conditions that make them minorities, right? And so not in every situation, I'm not minoritized, but when in spaces where the confluence of race and gender, and in some instances, class or age or size matter, then I can, easily be minoritized. And in other instances, I'm not, and I can exercise power in ways that a minoritized person cannot. And so you'll hear me use the language of racially minoritized students who, based upon their race and the racial conditions of our society, are racially minoritized. Next concept you'll hear me use is white supremacy, and often alongside racism. But I think about white supremacy as an ideology, as a pattern of values and beliefs that are ingrained in everything that we do, that it is baked into our legal system, in our educational system, and so on and so forth. Were it not, there would be no need for my presentation today. I talk about racism. So a set of institutional, cultural, and interpersonal patterns and structures that create and reinforce advantages for people legally defined and socially constructed as white over any other group not deemed white. And so without white supremacy, we don't have racism, we don't have capitalism, we don't have patriarchy, we don't have the confluence of those systems of oppression. For the purposes of this conversation, racism, I'll focus on racism, but please know that I do not see racism disconnected from sexism and heterosexism and capitalism and militarism and so forth. And then lastly, critical consciousness. So the ability to identify, critique, and transform social forces that produce inequity. So in order for us to think about ourselves as racially conscious in the classroom, we have to have some level of critical consciousness, right? And this willingness to ask critical questions and to engage in critical self-reflection about how we reduce and dismantle inequities. All right. So this broader scope around this language brings us to the work of a mentor of mine, Estella Ben-Simone, who recently retired from University of Southern California. And her work has really been critical in terms of the language of equity-mindedness. And what I have appreciated about her work is that when she's talking about equity, she very much names racial equity. And so if you look across the work from the USC Center for Urban Education, and Estella Ben-Simone's work in particular, you'll see definitions similar to this. And so I am conceptually, I guess, thinking about racial consciousness and equity in the classroom through an equity-minded lens. And so this definition is a summary of that with a little bit of my own perspective incorporated, but it refers to the perspective or mode of thinking among individuals who call attention to patterns of inequity and subsequent outcomes and are willing to take personal responsibility and institutional responsibility for disrupting those patterns. And it also requires race consciousness and awareness of the social and historical context of exclusionary practices that disproportionately affect racially minoritized students. So you see some of that language I mentioned is right there. Okay, so when we think about equity-mindedness, there are four things. One, if we're gonna think about racial consciousness and equity-mindedness in the classroom, there has to be a willingness and skill, to call attention to patterns of inequity and subsequent outcomes, to take personal responsibility for disrupting these patterns, assessing one's own practices, and being conscious and aware of social and historical practices. And so I'm going to pause here and just ask you all to just reflect for a minute, really quick, if you've engaged in any of these different aspects of equity-mindedness, just type the number into the chat box and a quick example. So I found a way to look at the chat box. I didn't think I could do it, but
nice.
I'm getting there. Okay, so I'm going to continue on, but as you all think of things, please do share them in the box. I see some of you have engaged in all of them. Some have done a lot of, calling attention to inequitable patterns and outcomes, and being conscious and aware of social and historical practices. And so that's good. All right. So if we think about racial challenges, I only have one example. I was going to put a whole bunch of examples in here, but one that I thought might be important to think about as far as racial consciousness in the classroom, and regardless of what field of study the faculty member or instructor is in. A good portion of my work focuses on Black women and their experiences in college. And I know that more recently there was an issue with the student body president, a Black woman, a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha, and her being terrorized, right? And being subjected to racist and white supremacist acts. And so what it made me think about, as I prepared for this presentation, was how many faculty chose to incorporate that into the classroom, even if it was taking 15 minutes at the start of the class to say, hey, this happened, let's process it, let's talk about it. And the case may be that if you had a class full of white students, that you may not have felt it was important. Perhaps if there were Black students or other racially minoritized students, you may have. But when we talk about racial consciousness in the classroom, it isn't just the curriculum that we have set up for the class and the authors who we have students read and all of those sorts of things. The curriculum is everywhere, right? It is how we take these things that are happening within and beyond the classroom and use them as tools to enhance our students' own consciousness around race and racism and white supremacy. So that's, I think a main challenge is that people don't think beyond standard notions of what the curriculum is, right? And that it can be larger than what we put on a syllabus or, what's in a text, and those things that are typically associated with the curriculum. So how do we use the things that happen on campus to point out racial inequities, to do self-reflection and so on, those things that are associated with equity-mindedness. All right. So if we think about, read Inside Higher Ed, read the Chronicle of Higher Ed, there's no shortage of examples where faculty have, said problematic things in the classroom or done problematic things where students are concerned, particularly racially minoritized students. But when it comes to thinking about the challenges, like why is it so hard to talk about, race in the classroom, or why is it so hard to incorporate it and think about it in a STEM classroom, or, I don't know, a basket weaving class. It doesn't matter, right? It's not the field, it's how we situate ourselves as instructors. But some of those common themes tend to be that talking about race is racist, right? I've heard a lot more recently that critical race theory is in itself racist. I'm still trying to figure that one out. That many people have a lack of training and lack of awareness, just have not participated in professional development opportunities and really weren't socialized to their respective fields to talk about these sorts of things. And again, given that we're in a heightened political context, I feel like we're always there, but this one in particular is really heightened. But some instructors may feel it's safer to ignore racial topics or to deny the reality of race. There is very much a color evasive ideology that exists where people say they don't see color, they see all their students, the same. There is also the desire to minimize or window dress race in the work that we do. So to come across as if you really care about these topics when you really don't, do the things that look good, right? And then this feeling of embarrassment and feeling ashamed that one has made it to a certain point in their career without having ever really engaged in substantive conversation and thought and topic around race and racism. So Geneva Gay says, too many teachers and teacher educators think that their subjects, particularly math and science and cultural diversity, are incompatible, or that combining them is too much of a conceptual and substantive stretch for their subjects to maintain disciplinary integrity. And even though she's saying this in the context of K through 12 learning, it is the same in higher education, right? That sometimes it's really hard for some of our faculty to see how these topics connect with the work that they're doing. And so they don't engage students around it. So I want us to explore possibilities through critical race theory. Even though, again, there's, efforts to ban critical race theory for whatever reason, I see it as a very important framework to help us to think about racial consciousness and equity in the classroom. So I've started with equity mindedness as a conceptual piece, and now I'm moving to critical race theory as a theoretical model for us to think about this. So what is critical race theory? Some of you may have heard it, may not have not, but it's a collection of activists and scholars interested in studying and transforming the relationship among race, racism, and power, has its roots in the legal field. And a major goal of critical race theory is the elimination of racial oppression as part of a larger goal to eradicate all forms of oppression. It's as simple as that, right? How do we dismantle racism and white supremacy, whether it's in the classroom, the legal system, or wherever we may be. And so critical race theory has, several tenets, depending on what field you're in. Some tenets tend to, are more amplified than others, but across texts and across fields, you'll see, this idea that racism is normal, right? It's not something that is exceptional in nature. So if you're a racially minoritized person, it's likely that you've experienced some form of racism or racial microaggression, whether you recognize it or not, and that it is in every system in which we operate in this country. Critical race theory challenges ahistoricism, right? This depiction of history where we have these, white people, right, who are the victors and who have, saved everyone and have done all of these great things. And I think if you were to look at American universities, history and some of the rituals and things that students do is the same at The Ohio State. If you were to walk down a hallway and see presidents, many of them would be white men, right? But there's a context for why most university presidents have historically been white men, right? Disrupting colorblindness and claims of neutrality. So it goes back to this idea of, I don't see race, when very clearly it's okay to see race, right? It's what we do when we do see race. It insists on centering racially marginalized voices and experiences. And it explicitly names racism and white supremacy and doesn't call it anything else. It is based on Derek Bell's concept of racial realism, or this belief that, racism and white supremacy aren't necessarily going to end, right? So they become different things over time, but that doesn't mean that we as a collective don't fight to continue to dismantle it. And then there is the concept of intersectionality that is very much a part of critical race feminism, and how we understand the confluence of systems that oppress people in particular ways, right? So that it ensures some groups fall through the cracks. Then two other concepts that I think are important as we think about the classroom are interest convergence and whiteness as property. And again, Derek Bell talks about interest convergence as this notion that the interests of Black people is accommodated only when it converges with the interests of white people. And so we see this in higher education when we think about diversity initiatives or the hiring of a chief diversity officer, right? These roles are important. They're, they play a significant role on the campus, but there's an interest served by our institutions when we have them, right? There's also an interest served for racially minoritized groups who believe that our campuses should be more diverse and that there should be more efforts there. Whiteness as property. Cheryl Harris in 1993 wrote about whiteness as property, and she talks about 4 property rights. One, the rights of disposition, meaning the ability to transfer white skin from generation to generation, right? So white skin in and of itself is property, is her argument. Rights to use and enjoyment. So by virtue of having white skin, you get to enjoy the privileges associated with being white. So there's access to different resources and so on, being heard, being believed, which is related to reputation and status property. And then also the absolute right to exclude. So having spaces and resources that primarily white people would have access to, right? That other minoritized groups have to fight to have access to those resources. So that's critical race theory in a nutshell. And I've taught whole semester long and summer long courses on this. So what I've just done in these 2 slides by no means does critical race theory any justice. But what critical race theory helps us to understand is that there is something very much broken when we think about education. When we think about all of these different social systems, there's something broken. So Giles and Hughes, they did a special issue on critical race theory for the International Journal of Qualitative Studies in Education. And one of the things they say in their article is, how is significant change possible if we accept the premise that nothing is broken? And so the question I would pose to you all is your teaching method, classroom environment, and or the curriculum method broken, right? And I'll just briefly go through some of these, but these are like 11 things that I would say indicate there's some brokenness there, right? So relying on a banking method of education where you as the instructor are the sole authority that you're pouring into students. If your course is designed to weed out students rather than support them so that all students can be successful, it's broken. If the overwhelming majority of authors and scholars who students read about are white men, it's broken. If attrition is treated as a naturally occurring thing, right? There's something broken. If students of color are frequently without group partners and collaborators, right? Something is broken. Efforts to move on from race-related conversations. If all the guest speakers are white, right? If the majority of students in the classroom are white. And so by the mere presence of whiteness, that does not necessarily suggest brokenness. What I'm saying is if you as an instructor are not questioning why that is, then there's something broken there that needs to be questioned, that needs to be thought about. Like, why isn't this space more diverse? Why aren't there more voices represented in this space, right? And what are the consequences of that? So along the lines of critical race theory, Tara Yoso talks about this notion of a critical race curriculum, right? And if we think about a critical race curriculum, it has to have, there needs to be a centrality and intersectionality of race and racism. The space has to challenge dominant ideology. There has to be some commitment to social justice. There has to be a valuing of the centrality of experiential knowledge for minoritized groups. And then it has to have interdisciplinary perspectives, right? And so when she talks about a critical race curriculum, again, she's not talking about just the syllabus and the readings. It is, what are the activities? What are the assignments? How are the students engaged? How does the class you're teaching fit within the larger curriculum? Like all of these pieces, right? What do the faculty look like? You know, why are you the person teaching particular classes, for example? All of these things make up the curriculum, and they communicate certain things to students, and especially for those who go on to become faculty, they get socialized into what the curriculum becomes based upon our classrooms. So if we are going to question this brokenness and begin to interrogate whiteness and white supremacy in the classroom, I strongly encourage you, if you don't have these 2 books, Interrogating Whiteness and Relinquishing Power, and then Race, Equity, and the Learning Environment, these are 2 excellent books if you're really committed to being a racially conscious instructor and having equity mindedness in the classroom, right? but these scholars collectively ask questions for faculty and instructors to think about. So which grand narratives are reflected in the curriculum, and what are students learning in my courses through the hidden curriculum? So the hidden curriculum are those things that happen behind the scenes. They aren't spoken, right? But they're kind of, they're there, right? How does my experience with privilege and oppression influence how I show up in the classroom? So I think about what it means for me to be a Black woman showing up in the classroom, because in many instances, I'm the first Black woman, Black teacher, that some students have ever had, meaning they've gone through an entire education system and haven't really had diverse instruction, right? Um, and what that means. One, what does it mean for students who look like me in the classroom, but also what does it mean for students who don't look like me, right? And what assumptions are students carrying as we engage in our learning environment? How aware am I of how students are experiencing my classroom, right? And do I ask questions? And would students describe me as racially conscious, or my classroom as a pedagogical site for Black liberation, or for racial justice? So if there is a commitment to, disrupting what I'm calling brokenness for the sake of this conversation, we have to start asking these sorts of questions, right? And these are the things you ask before you start pulling, the syllabus together, or before you start, making sense of teaching evaluations that don't say what you want them to say, right? These are the questions that need to sort of be carrying you as an instructor throughout. So fixing what's broken. When I do these, everybody wants, solutions. And I wish I had solutions for everything. So I'm just going to give you all what I think will be helpful in terms of your own classes. And these, I think these are like 101. These are a starting point. By no means should they be the end all be all to how you engage in uh, racial consciousness and equity mindedness in the classroom. So one, just acknowledging that racism is real and that it has material consequences, right? There are consequences based upon who's teaching, what they're teaching, who's in the classroom, who benefits from that teaching, and so on. And when we think about racism and white supremacy broadly, um, everybody has some level of complicity, right? It's about owning it, right? Understanding what that complicity is, and being able to name it. Doing purposeful reexamination and changing of classroom policies and curricular decisions. Every year, well, prior to my administrative role, I would go through, my syllabus and think about the policies and what does this mean for the most vulnerable student? This particular policy. If I'm only having office hours at this particular time, what does it mean for a student who's a parent, right? What does it mean for a student who has to work a lot and can't make these particular office hours, right? Where's the flexibility? Making linkages between systemic racism and other forms of oppression. So again, it doesn't matter what field of study you're in. I think every student needs to have an understanding of how our fields came to be what they are today. And much of that, honestly, is connected to histories of racism and white supremacy, particularly who were the subjects of studies and who got tested on. And there are all of these different pieces, no matter what field. There is a racial and racialized history there that is important for students. And then just sort of avoiding this performative racism. Again, this I care, I want to, be there, and I want to, be present with you all. All of these things that people say, right? And then the actions say something different. Another thing is just raising expectations for yourself and your students. I don't think any class is full enough for us to capture everything. But the goal of a class is to get students so excited that they even want to research things on their own, or they begin to develop their own questions and their own inquiries. I think we have to re-articulate problems. And I've said this time and time again in talks where faculty often take a deficit-minded perspective when it comes to racially minoritized students, or the belief that they're lazy, they're not working hard enough, all of these things. And what happens is that problems are situated with the students rather than situated within the classroom, the syllabus, or the structures that cause challenges for students. It's of course very important to have a diverse pool of teachers and faculty and instructors doing professional development, so participating in sessions like this, and then actively changing the environment and the culture. And I have some thoughts on, how to do this later on. Um, One thing that I am purposeful about is trying to understand diverse cultures and perspectives in the classroom, right? I don't want, to the extent possible, I have implicit biases, and I want to be thoughtful about, how I'm engaging with students, particularly if they are from a different background than mine, right? I don't want to go into this space and just assume that I know. And so I do research. I don't assume that I know everything. Um, and I think about the syllabus, like what are the artifacts, images, and symbols that are represented in that syllabus, demonstrating care for students. So what are students' needs and how do you show concern, right? Concern oftentimes for me is students needing an extension, right? I know I've set deadlines because it suits me, and I know, I want to have a full Thanksgiving break and all of these other things, but I'm also committed to being very flexible with students because they have lives too, right? Now, I don't know that I was necessarily socialized to believe that I had a life that was more important than my instructors, right? But I understand that students have lives beyond me. They are parents too, right? They have things that they need to take care of. And so being more thoughtful about that, and doing classroom activities and forms of engagement that don't breed competition, but are instead focused on cooperation and team building and community building. And then just thinking about how I position myself when I enter into the classroom, right? I don't want to be teaching students to do something that I myself am not willing to do. And if I'm not willing to do it, I'm not going to teach it, or I'm going to have a conversation with students about, why it's a struggle for me, or what is unique about my circumstance where I still think it's important for them to engage, but these are the reasons that I would not necessarily do it, right? So it's having a level of vulnerability with students, I think, is so important, and it certainly shows care and compassion. So Salazar and Tuitt in 2010 wrote this book chapter, and in the chapter they list, it's like a laundry list, right? It's huge, of all of these things that individuals can do to promote equity in the classroom. And these are just a few of them. Again, it's not the end all be all, but I thought they raised some really good points, just pronounce a student's name correctly, right? Say a student's pronouns the way that they would want you to say them, avoiding tokenizing students in the classroom, inviting student feedback on instruction. So as faculty, we're in a power position. We don't have to ask students for feedback, but if we care and we want to do better, then feedback is really important, right? And consistently challenging racist and prejudicial remarks in the classroom. I do that, but I'm also teaching students to be able to do it, right? There's going to come a time when I'm not in the boardroom, I'm not at work with you. And so I'm modeling for you, this is how you address this situation, right? This is how you call it. Don't wait, say something in the moment to address the situation. And then, oops. The rest of these are ideas that I got. I read a lot of Inside Higher Ed, and there are plenty of articles where faculty are given ideas around how they promote racial equity in the classroom. One way that I found really beneficial is just co-construction of the syllabus, right? Taking time and leaving space in the syllabus so that students can talk about things that interest them related to the topic of the course. I think it's really important. I've talked about vulnerability from the instructor, but I think it's also important to think about the vulnerable students in the classroom. So when you have a classroom and it is predominantly male, and you have one woman student, or you have a trans student, right? Or if it is predominantly white, you have a black student, right? Like all of these different dynamics, I think, make certain students vulnerable, and you as an instructor have to be thoughtful about that and how you support that student and ensure that that student has an opportunity to voice their perspectives, and that they're not being talked over or dismissed or being left out. Um, this idea of anonymous grading, I've gone back and forth about it, but what I have done is taken papers, graded them anonymously, because it helps me to think about the implicit biases I had while I was reading it, right? So I do go back and look at the student's name and see how I assigned it. And I, have made adjustments, right? Because I've checked myself. So it's not on the student, it's on me, and how I've made sense of the work that they've submitted using case studies, peer instruction. So there are any number of ways to make students feel like they matter, that they are, that knowledge is being co-constructed, that they too can be knowledge producers and authorities in the classroom as well. And then lastly, as we think about enacting equity in the classroom, these are things that I think about. I didn't get them from anybody, but these are just personal things that are always on my mind, when I'm going to teach. What am I doing to disrupt the status quo? Who's, falling through the cracks? I'm very, very thoughtful about students in groups, right? How groups form, and whether or not it's a clique, or whether or not, students are being open to group dynamics. Whether or not I'm working hard enough, and if there's more that I can or should be doing. I often think about, what will students say, about me, not necessarily on the teaching evaluations, right? Because those are problematic, right? There are ways to do them better. But what will they think when they leave the classroom? And I realize that in classes where I'm specifically talking about race and racism, many students don't like them, but it is meaningful later on for those students to come back and say, I learned a lot. I was resistant. I know I gave you a hard time or whatever, but I appreciate, what you did. For those who aren't familiar with engaging in these sorts of conversations, it's important to think, why do I feel afraid? Why do I feel guilty? Or why do I feel defensive about particular topics? And then, what's going to be different as a result of my teaching? So these are, all of the things that I tend to think about when it comes to racial equity. And I'm going to stop share here because I want to leave some time for question. But thank you so much for engaging me and giving me an opportunity. I know it was a presentation, but I also felt like I was kind of teaching. But thank you. And I will turn it back over to Brian.
Absolutely, absolutely. So first and foremost, I would like to round of applause virtually on the screen for offering so much rich content. There were so many nuggets of wisdom and advice that I think we all can use in our teaching, and things that we may already do, or things that we haven't even considered, or things that we can do better, right? And so, when you know better, you do better. And I just feel like you provided so much content for us. So again, thank you. And now we're going to transition into a Q&A period. There's a lot of affirmation in the chat as well. So you see that there on the right. Are there any questions? Any questions that you may be thinking about? If you have a question and come on camera, if you can just say your name and where you're affiliated, that would be great. Just so, again, we're not in person, so just trying to build some sense of community. But so feel free to come on, and I'll also watch the chat. But any questions on camera? Any questions? All right, Joni.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Patton Davis. This is absolutely fantastic. I am the Senior Director at our Office of Academic Excellence at the law school. And so this is very empowering, I think, in terms of how we work and support our students at the law school. But I was very interested in the question you raised about how faculty can challenge racist and or prejudicial remarks in the classroom. And I think I'd like to ask you to maybe go a step back to actually talk about how to identify kind of prejudicial and racist work. Because a lot of times students can say things in the classroom and some professors just might not even recognize that it was something that could have been either offensive or that certain students might take it as offensive. So are there kind of strategies or ways to kind of be on alert, or just kind of what are the things to look out for, I guess, when students are having conversations in the classroom?
I think it's important at the outset. So I always tell students, I'm not going to catch everything, and so I need you all to be again, instructors and learners alongside with me. So if I don't catch it, it's okay for you to catch it. And I try to give them language around it. So it's not necessarily, oh, I can't believe you said that, or, or jumping down someone's throat or whatever. But I will usually ask a student, so can you say a little bit more about that? Can you help us to understand your perspective? And so just asking probing questions. And usually the questioning, gets students to a point where they kind of give up or, come to realize, oh, I see why that was problematic. That I've done that tons of times. And it is just simply a matter of providing space for the student to think about what they just said. In other cases, like I was doing, one workshop, and this is for teachers. One of the teachers kept referring to undocumented people as illegals and illegal aliens, right? And that one I just couldn't let slide. I just told her, so for this presentation, here's the kind of language that we need to use, because we're talking about people. We're not talking about aliens, right? This is not a sci-fi movie. We are talking about real people. And so let's regard them, with some humanity and some dignity. And I mean, she wasn't offended, but she hadn't thought about it. In her family, or, in her, group or whatever, that's the language that she used. But I needed her to know we can't use that here, and it's problematic. And again, I try to correct people in a way that doesn't shut them out of the conversation. Like if I'm shutting you out, then that sort of defeats the purpose of education, right? I want you to still be engaged. So those are some of the things that I do. If it's that blatant and problematic, then I'm more likely to say something. And I think the way I'm talking about it now might give you the impression, that it's easy, or that, that it just kind of rolls off the tongue. And sometimes it's really hard, because some things students might say are a personal affront to me, right? But it is through just trying to remain reflective that this whole conversation isn't about me and how I feel. It's a learning space. And so how do we use, this problematic language or, something someone has said as a learning moment? And the reality is that some students, I've had students come to my office and tell me how offended they were because they felt singled out. But again, my question is, well, let's talk a little bit about why you feel singled out. Why are you feeling that way? So that we can, just think about, help them understand why some of the things they're saying is problematic, right? And that it's okay to feel that way, but don't stay there. So I don't know if that answers the question.
It does.
Okay.
It does.
And
Thank you.
sometimes people don't catch
Thank you.
it, right? There have been situations that I didn't catch in the classroom and nobody said anything.
Right.
You know, I'm reflecting after the fact, and I'm like, wait a minute. And I'll start class with that the next week, because if it was offensive to someone who didn't say anything or didn't feel empowered to say anything, try to catch it.
Got it. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you. Lori, we have a question in the chat and I'm going to lift up here. Are there strategies for addressing microaggressions if you are an instructor and experiencing incidents directly from a student? So thinking about student to instructor microaggressions, and also dealing with the microaggressions that may come from a department that may not be supportive. So thinking about addressing your director or supervisor. So I'm getting a sense there's a student to instructor, but also thinking about at the department level of microaggressions that occur.
You know, I think it just depends on the situation. I have been lucky enough to be in spaces where if I felt like I was being targeted by a student, that I had a department chair or a program chair or a dean who was supportive of that. But I realized that's not everybody's experience. For faculty who are experiencing microaggressions and aren't feeling supported within their respective unit, you might seek the support of an ombudsperson at the university. You might talk with someone in the university's HR about, you know, I don't know, it depends on what the microaggression is or if it feels like some form of harassment. I think those are a starting point, but it is also okay, I think, in how you approach it to say, hey, you know, I'm noticing these things and, you know, they feel, you know, I'm taking offense to them. You know, and I'm not sure if you're meaning to do this. Like, it depends on what some people don't know, right? Or they haven't been taught to know. And so to me, it deals with your level of tolerance, you know, how much of it, you know, can you take, right? You know, microaggressions build up. And so I think it's important to address it early on if you feel comfortable doing so. And if not, you know, identifying a trusted friend or colleague with whom you can talk it through. I've had assistant professors who I mentor. I'm not at their institution, but they weren't getting support in their department, and it ended up going up to the dean. And there was support from the dean. The important part is to not be afraid to seek out the help, right? Or to seek out the support that you need.
Thank you for that. And I also want to direct folks to some of the recent work here, our Equity and Title IX office, and I just dropped this in the chat as well. So again, this is our office on campus as well, just provide another context to Lori's answer there. So feel free to use that as well. Tara, thank you for your question here. Are there other questions? I tell you, Lori, you did that CRT in those 2 slides. I said that's a whole course. I remember the CRT course. Very succinct. Other questions that may. Thank you, Rachel. Other questions.
Hi. This is how you doing? Let me see if I can turn my camera on. Just
no problem. And who is this talking?
This is Loretta Daniels. I teach in School of Public Affairs, and I had a question because I'm trying to do 2 things at one time, but I was also listening to the conversation. But I do have a question for Dr. Patton Davis. I know there was some conversation around cultural responsive teaching, and then of course critical race theory. For someone, of course, the world is getting this confused, right? So how would you have that conversation in a classroom, and when you have all this other rhetoric that's in this space outside of the classroom? How do you bring it into your classroom to let the students know that, hey, they can be intertwined, but the way that they're intertwined in the world is not the way we should be looking at it? I don't know. I just want to hear what your thoughts are about that.
I like to use examples. and concrete examples where there's evidence that suggests that something, how we're being taught something or how things have conventional, knowledge is actually wrong. I think concrete examples are good. I'm trying to think of one. I haven't taught critical race theory in a while. Let me think. Oh, here's an example. So my field is higher education, and in most doctoral programs, you have to take a history of higher ed class, right? And Brian knows this. The way history is taught, lots of interesting things happen, right, for our institutions to be established. But never had I attended a class where there was a, direct connection to the transatlantic slave trade, right? And so that might be one way to help students understand that our colleges and universities, as great as they are, were built off of, the economic wealth that was not, given to those who did the work, which was, enslaved Africans, right? Like there is a pretext or there's history there. And so to the extent possible, I would encourage you to use concrete examples, right? You can't deny what this history is saying. You can't, and the book I'm thinking of is Ebony and Ivy by Craig Stephen Wilder. When I tell you this man gave receipts, he went through every receipt, you name it, right? He traced lineages, right? So that we could better understand why Harvard has the endowment that it has and Howard has the endowment that it has, right? So I think using concrete examples is always very helpful. In the context of, you said you were in public health, is that right?
No, public affairs. I
Public
teach in
affairs.
public affairs, yes.
Public affairs, okay, because I was thinking about, in some areas, racism has been considered to be a public health crisis all of a sudden, right? But there are some people who don't think you get sick from racism, right? But there are statistics that would indicate a shortened lifespan for Black people and other minoritized groups who are consistently having to deal with racism and oppression in society, right? So I like to use statistics, any sort of documentation, and if I may have gone off the deep end for your question, but if it is just explaining the differences between critical race theory and culturally relevant teaching and culturally relevant pedagogy, there's a distinct difference to me in that critical race theory is about dismantling, racism and white supremacy. And perhaps we can do some of that through culturally relevant teaching. But I think culturally relevant teaching is more about how do we make students see themselves in the curriculum? How do we make them feel like they matter? And that does address one of CRT's tenets around the experiential knowledges of people of color. So I don't think they're too far off. They're just not the same thing.
Thank you so much for that, because although the rhetoric is...
I noticed, wait.
Thank you. Thank you. Naoko, I see your hand.
Hi, I'm currently teaching how to collaborate, the class about collaboration. Then, we do series of collaboration, then sometimes just like mix of, student race. Even I give them time to introduce each other, do some, questionnaire to each other relating to their difference.
Mm-hmm.
It's not always working well yet. And have you ever done any collaboration assignment, and then what kind of method do you use them to introduce, addressing their difference?
So if I think, let me repeat the question to make sure I got it. How do I help students to collaboratively engage.
Yeah,
Beginning.
especially mixed race or different culture background. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to send you the article I use. The Landau, I cited her in here. One method that she uses is recording. So, or setting up these ground rules where, you know, it might be you have, I don't know, a stuffed animal. Only the person with the stuffed animal gets to talk, and they get to, you know, respond to particular questions, and everyone else has to listen, right? And there might be one person who's designated as the conversation facilitator and another person who is designated as an observer, who might, you know, who can look at what the group has said and say, you know, I noticed that when this person was, you know, introducing themselves and talking, you were doing this. Or, you know, so it's like, you know, you interrupted, or I noticed that everybody was engaged when this person was talking, but not so much with this person, and having, you know, conversation and dialogue around it. But it has, the students need to have some ownership in it. But I think you as an instructor can offer some guidelines. So you might add some more complexity, so it's not just everybody going around, you know, introducing themselves, but like, what's the purpose of them introducing themselves? You know, think about that. Do you want them to know more about each other? Do you, you know, is that it? Or do you want them to be able to understand, you know, more about each other's backgrounds and their working styles? You know, the types of questions that they share about themselves should be purposeful, but based upon what your ultimate goal is, you know, why you're putting them in groups. I think so. I like the idea of groups and encouraging students to collaborate, but for you as an instructor, I would encourage you to think more about, well, what's the purpose of this? Like, am I doing this because, you know, I got 100 students and it just makes sense to do groups? Or, you know, like, and if I'm doing this, like, what do I want them to get out of this group experience? And making sure that each student in the group has a role to play. So it might be the facilitator. It might be the one who's taking minutes, and be careful about who's taking minutes, right? You know, all of these different pieces that make group work more fulfilling than when an instructor isn't as involved. Another thing around this, I have a good friend, she uses rubrics a lot. I'm not I have nothing against rubrics. I just don't have the time to put them together, but she does use a rubric for group settings. If I can get it, I'll send it to Brian, but I think that might also help, you know, students to understand that it's not just we're being put in groups to do an assignment, but we're put in groups to promote cross-cultural engagement between us, to, you know, develop relationships that we might not otherwise develop, or this class not, you know, or we not put in this group. So helping the students to think deeper about it too, I think is important.
Thank you, Rory, and I love to know the rubric and articles. So
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Talisa, one of our very own inclusive pedagogy fellows in CTRL. Talisa.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Patton Davis. I really enjoyed it. Thanks, Brian, for putting this together. Okay, so my question is, I strive really hard to get inclusivity right, and, you know, do the research, and I'm doing this fellowship on campus. What I wasn't prepared for, though, is kind of coming back in person. I feel like, particularly my Black and Brown students, they're a little rawer, more raw. Their responses have been intensified since coming back to campus. So for example, I've had two students. One student said, I was teaching racial residential segregation, you know, and they're like, oh, I teach in the School of Public Affairs, I'm a criminologist, okay. But I'm teaching racial residential segregation, and this one student's like, you know, well, I don't know about you guys, but I'm just tired of being around white people. Right? And then I've had another student say, you know, I showed a clip, I thought it was supposed to be fun, about, like, you know, the death penalty, and, you know, back in the day where somebody got their head chopped off. And another student said, you know, Dr. Carter, can you tell me what this person did? Because I'm feeling bad for him, and I don't like to have empathy for white men. And so and I've handled this, right? I'm handling it, but I think, and I think I've handled it well, right? I haven't gotten any fallout so far, but I just haven't been prepared. I think there's also kind of like this double-edged sword of like being good at inclusivity, that people get comfortable and then just say things. And so I'm wondering if you have any insight into kind of like when the classroom kind of creates conditions where people are really free to express themselves fully in ways that we want, but then we have to kind of deal with.
Mhm. So it sounds, if that was me, I probably would have stopped the conversation. Like I would have just stopped the lesson around residential segregation to say, it sounds like you all have thoughts. Like, like let's talk about them. Let's let's suspend the lesson, right? Why do you have an issue with feeling empathy for a while? Like I don't have an issue with stopping the class and like let's talk, because that sounded to me like like they are really feeling some type of way, and I'm sure it has to do with things that are well beyond, your class, even though the class material might be the thing that triggers it. So you might say, this is important information, you need to understand this as we think about residential segregation and why it persists. Um, and some people believe in, a trigger warning to say, hey, we're going to be talking about some really tough things and it might be triggering for you. And if that's the case, let's spend some time talking about it now. Or, when it comes up, let's talk about it now and just be okay. Like classes, what they last an hour, 15 minutes, sometimes 2 hours, 3 hours. Be okay with saying it's important that we talk about how you all are feeling about these sorts of topics, and it might be good, the next time you're teaching it at the beginning of the semester to say, aside from the trigger warning, like, let's have a community dialogue about how we'll address each other. Like this is a space where you should feel, comfortable saying what you need to say, but we also need to be thoughtful about how we make, our classmates feel, because we want everybody to be engaged, even if we don't agree or like each other. So those types of conversations, I think, help to set the stage, because I wonder, for the student who says, I don't want to feel empathy for a white man, I am wondering what that white man was thinking, right? And because that white man, because of his race and gender, has power in particular ways, how does he take that feeling and enact it in other settings that you don't see in the classroom? But, does he walk away thinking, black people don't like me? All of these things that can have consequences that none of us really want to deal with, right? And so having that sort of conversation, I think, is just critical, and acknowledging we're just in a tough time, right? Like we are, the racial polarization is real. It's a lot. And so if students don't have the space to talk about it in our classrooms, where else are they, processing it? The learning environment is the best. The classroom is one of the best places to do that, and to do it in a way that's educative. It's not everybody just venting, but we're going to learn why we need to vent, why we need to express these things, why we need to have dialogue. I don't know. That's not a perfect answer, but I don't think you can ever be prepared, because students come in feeling how they feel, but engaging them around, why do you feel this way right now? Talk about it. There could be other people in the class who really don't get it, who hadn't thought about any of this, right? They didn't see what happened with George Floyd. They ain't, watching, they don't know what happened on January 6th. These sorts of things. We think students watch the news, we think they're engaged, but in many instances, they're not. And this might be the space to engage students who are just clueless.
Well, thank you. I love the how and why there. 'Cause the point about it's not just venting, but it's the how and why. It's that construction. How do they arrive at that and being able to process that in the classroom space? I love that. I'm watching the clock. Let's give a virtual round of applause once again for having Dr. Lori Patton Davis join us today to kick off our CPTL series. And AU faculty and staff, stay tuned for the next event. I'll be putting that out here shortly. So thank you so much for your contributions and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thank you very